Good evening. Oh, I like this sound system. Nice. Good evening. Welcome to Open Table United Church of Christ. We're glad that you're here this evening on a nice, balmy Sunday evening with some great baseball that took place today. Anyway, yeah, we won't start singing it. Anyway, we are delighted that you are here for our Social Justice Speaker Series. This is the seventh gathering that we've had, and so we are delighted we see faces that are here regularly and new faces, and we hope that the different topics that we bring forth to the community are ones that folks continue to engage in the conversation afterward. Before I tell you a little bit, just a very brief little bit about tonight, I want to share a couple of logistics. First of all, obviously there are snacks and refreshment stuff that we have available out there, and afterward we have a great time of folks gathering around and talking and whatever. But just so you know where it is, restrooms are that way, and there's one to your right and then a couple to your left, including a family bathroom that's at the far end of the hallway on the left-hand side if need be. The other thing I want to share with you is our next Social Justice Speaker Series event is on October 27th, and it will be a panel discussion that has to do, what do we named it? The humanity of homelessness. So we have a broad panel of folks coming in with some different backgrounds, working with homelessness and population of folks who are homeless. And we are hoping to have a great discussion to be able to take some questions from the floor. But October 27th at 7 o'clock, the doors will open at 6:30. So we hope that you'll hear more about that soon and that you'll share that with other people. Tonight, we are delighted to have John Breslin come and speak to us, talking about immigration. John is a retired, or he thought he was retired, attorney, and now also does farming, and takes, from what I hear, really good direction about it a lot of the times from daughter Molly. But as the landscape of immigration and immigration issues has become very prevalent, John found himself gravitating in some very significant ways toward paying attention to that part of law. And he'll tell you more about the connections and all of that, how he got to where he is. But we're grateful that he's in the Illinois Valley area and is helping us to understand and is a connection and some legal advising for folks who might be dealing with immigration issues. So without further ado, I'd like to invite you to welcome John Breslin as he comes forward.
Thank you, Pastor Kim, and I'll assure you at the outset I'm not going to talk about law. And the way I have developed an interest in this area of the law, though, is that some friends of mine came to me some time ago when the political landscape was changing and said, "John, you're a lawyer. Will you help me with these immigration problems that I have?" And I said, "Well, I have to learn more about it." So I started studying it pretty seriously, and I'm doing that now as I guess that's my second career in law. I was prosecutor for about 30 years, and I got burned out on that, and took a little time off and helped Molly with her organic farm until people came to me and said that they needed help, and I realized I had a skill that wasn't being used, and I had better do something about it. So, but law isn't really what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is something that I came upon, or that I realized needed to be talked about, and that is the social feelings behind attitudes towards immigrants. What's behind this anti-immigrant sentiment or fever? Where does it come from? And just to start out, I'm not big on audience participation, but I want to ask for a show of hands to make a point, and my hand will be raised. If you have no European blood in your family history, if you have no African blood in your family history, if you have no Asian blood in your family history, if the blood in your veins is only from people from North and South America, no Spanish, no Irish, no Chinese, raise your hand.
I'm Irish.
No European blood. Only indigenous people blood. Well, what does that tell us? We're all from immigrant families. But a lot of us have forgot how far back that happened. I don't. I knew my grandfather till I was 12, came from Ireland. He was an immigrant. Never became a citizen, but he was more Irish than he ever was American. He never read or wrote English. So I have a connection to immigrant feeling. Maybe you do too. Maybe you're lucky enough to know the people in your family that were immigrants. Maybe not. So, you know, you've seen this picture, you maybe have read this poem. I want to explore how we got from that to this. They were chanting, you might have heard this on the news, Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us. What do the Jews have to do with a Civil War monument? What does a Civil War monument have to do with immigration? Well, I hope to make that connection. But in the course of it, I want to tell you or help you discover who the you are that they were talking about, that will not replace them. So, what I'm going to do, how I'm going to do this is, I'm going to give you some strategies. I'm going to bring up some arguments that people have against immigrants and immigration. And then I'm going to try and get behind those arguments that people have so that you can find out what's behind their attitudes so that you can do something about it. And I'm going to use some stories. Some of the stories are my stories. Some are stories from other people to make the points about these attitudes that people have, so that we can figure out, if you're interested, that you can figure out how to do something about this anti-immigrant fever that we have in the country today, because I think it's a problem. So there are people who can be convinced and people who can't be convinced. And how do you go about finding out what you can say to change people's minds? I had a boss one time, I came back from Vietnam, I got a job as a public defender in Cook County. And the boss was an immigrant from Belfast. And he left there when he was a kid to get away from violence and poverty. And he kind of took me under his wing. And he said, my first day on the job, he said, what do you know about being a lawyer? And I said, very little, almost nothing, probably nothing. He said, good, I'm going to teach you. He said, I'm working on a case of a black man who was convicted of shooting a white woman. He said, I was his trial lawyer and I lost. He's in jail, but I'm going to get him out of jail. I'm going to make an argument in the Illinois Supreme Court and you're going to help me. And here's how we're going to do it. He said, I'm going to give you a list. Come back after lunch. I'm going to give you a list. And on the list are going to be the several issues that I have to convince those 7 guys on the Supreme Court of Illinois to change their mind on. And you're going to go in the law library and you're going to find all the cases that these 7 judges wrote on these issues. And we're going to figure out what's going to convince them to change their minds. Except for one guy. He's so stuck on his issue, we're not going to change his mind. I've known him for a long time. We're not going to worry about him. Forget about him. The other guys, maybe we can change some of their minds. So the technique was find out what's behind their reasoning, what's behind their words, and then we can figure out how to go about convincing them or anybody to change an opinion. But at least as important was don't waste your time on people you can't convince. You know, today in society, there are people who we can't convince. climate change deniers. Not going to change their mind. You take a guy that's got 38 guns in his basement and 100,000 rounds of ammunition because when the government falls and the people are coming down from the barrios and ghettos to take over our town, he's going to be ready. Don't worry about him. You're not going to change his mind about gun control. Work on somebody else. White supremacists fall in that category, I think. Maybe we shouldn't waste our time on some of them. You can't reason with a fanatic, I guess, is the sum of that. Let me tell you a couple of factoids to kind of set the picture here. 7 of the 39 men who signed the Constitution were immigrants. When George Washington chose the first 9 justices of the Supreme Court, 3 of them were immigrants. A third of them were immigrants. 4 of the first 6 secretaries of the Treasury were immigrants. You've heard of the MacArthur Foundation. MacArthur Fellows, they call them Genius Grants. 965 of them have been given out since they started this in '81, I think. 209 of those people were born in another country. People that lived in the US that won Nobel Prizes, 911 of them, have been given out since they started the Nobel Prizes. 350 of those 911 were from US. 100 of them were immigrants. Now, these are all smart guys. Listen to this story. This isn't my story. Somebody recently said, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. The man who said that never met Manuel, my friend. Manuel was 16 when he came from Sonora to the F-Bar, my family's ranch, outside the town of Snowflake, Arizona, in northern Arizona. I was a kid. I was 6 years old. To me, he looked like a full-grown man. He wasn't much more than a kid himself, but he worked as if his family depended on it. They probably did. He couldn't have worked harder if the ranch were his own. In terms of material possessions, Manuel was an invisible man. His capacity for working hard, breaking his back, was his sole credential in life. By no Washington bureaucrat's estimate would he have been judged a high-value immigrant. He didn't speak much English. He didn't come from money, never finished high school. He had no technological innovation to his credit, never started a business. In other words, he was among the 99% who come to this country, including many of our ancestors, my grandfather among them, who just got here as fast as they could to make this country what it is today once they arrived. All Manuel had to recommend was his strength and his belief that America was a place where by the labor of your hands, you could create a life for yourself. That's all, and that's everything. History doesn't record much about the unglamorous farming work, ranching work, moving sprinkler pipe, digging ditches, chopping hay, keeping a broken feed truck running for just one more year. Manuel did all this. Manuel worked so much that he was the heart of our farm. I think he was about the most high-value immigrant possible. All told, he devoted 24 years of his life to the ranch. In the 70s, he would marry, get a green card, which gave him permanent residence status. He and his wife, Frances, ultimately raised 7 kids, 3 boys, 4 girls. All of them now are contributing members of American society. There must be a place in America for those whose only initial credentials are a strong back and an eagerness to use it. America would be a lesser country without Manuel and so many like him. You know who said that? A Republican senator from Arizona, a guy by the name of Jeff Flake. He's the junior senator. He sees that you don't want only Nobel Prize winners. So, what are some of the arguments you hear against immigrants and immigration? I'm going to take some of the easy ones first. Here's the first one. Economic arguments. They take jobs from Americans. They depress the wages of labor. They're draining the public coffers because they're consuming tax dollars and not contributing. Well, you hear this a lot. It reminds me of this word, alligators. A long time ago, Mayor Daley, old Mayor Daley, not Richie, Mayor Daley's, the first Mayor Daley, was accosted by a reporter, and the reporter said to him, Mayor, somebody got a contract, a company got a contract for the concession stands in O'Hare Airport. And some of the people that lost the bidding pointed out that this fellow that got the contract made a large donation to the Democratic Party. And Mayor Daley said, those are just allegations, and look who the alligators are. So, when I look for facts on the internet, like we all do, I looked for facts about this economic argument against immigrants. And I saw studies that went this way, and I saw studies that went that way. And you can do the same thing. You can find studies. You can probably find a study to show you anything at all that you already believe. But look at the alligators. Who makes these studies up? Who hired them to make these studies up? That's how you judge whether you can really put any faith in what you read to support arguments. Modern communications really isn't very much help to us here. Social media has really helped us spread disinformation. Anybody that's got an interest can set up an institute, have them do a study, put it on the internet. It's all over the internet. A funny example is the Flat Earth Society. You know, after the eclipse on the 21st of August, there were several videos went up on YouTube that sought to prove that the Earth was flat by the eclipse. So you can find a study to prove anything. Look at the alligators. So here's where I went to find statistics on the economic issues behind immigration. I found a study by the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, pretty well established organization. I judged that they didn't have an axe to grind. And they told me in their study, it's about 2 years old, that jobs really are not taken away from Americans by immigrants. Current immigrants are taking jobs away from immigrants that came earlier, not from people who were born here. And they're not depressing wages except for a very small segment of the wage pool. High school dropouts are getting a lot of competition from recent immigrants. Other than that, they don't see statistical evidence of that. Are they draining the public coffers? Well, they're not. For this reason, they're contributing a lot more in taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes. Whether they own or rent, they're paying property taxes. As a matter of fact, 75% of undocumented immigrants are paying into Social Security and Medicare. And they're never going to get that money out, even if they later become citizens. So I think there are facts out there, if you want to find them, that show that this is not a drain on our society economically. Here's another argument. You've heard this one. They're criminals, they're drug dealers, they're rapists. This is what this guy said just the other day about Portland, Oregon. Police may be forced to release pedophiles, rapists, murderers, drug dealers, arsonists back into the community where they've no right to be in the first place. This state of lawlessness allows gangs to smuggle drugs, guns, even humans across the border around our communities and around our cities. Well, I don't think I'm going to bother trying to convince him to change his mind. But here's what I found. A National Bureau of Economic Research study. Now that's not a government agency. It's a not-for-profit agency. But it's got 26 Nobel Prize winners that are affiliated with it. Found that immigrants are arrested 20% as much, 20% of the time compared to native-born Americans. So, native-born Americans are 5 times more likely to be arrested for a crime than an immigrant. I found another study by the Cato Institute, pretty right-wing organization. Their statistics showed that immigrants were only arrested half as much as native-born Americans. So, here's a statistic that kind of convincingly, to me at least, from several sources, disproves the theory that Jeff Sessions and others would have us believe. It's another argument. They broke the law. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with breaking the law. It's an insult to all us citizens that they came here. Well, what laws did they break? A person comes here from another country and overstays his visa. He hasn't committed a crime. What he's done is broken a civil law. Same kind of law that you and I break when we cheat on our income tax, when we don't pay our property tax. Now, if he happens to have crossed the border illegally without being inspected at a border checkpoint, he does commit a crime. It's a misdemeanor. Crossing without inspection is a misdemeanor. There's a fine. There can be a jail sentence up to 6 months. If I drive without a license in Illinois, the penalty's the same, up to 6 months imprisonment. If I drive when I've had too much to drink, the penalty is twice as much as it is for crossing the border. So give that some kind of comparison when somebody says, oh, they're breaking the law by coming here. Brings up a quote to my mind of a fellow who's quoted a lot from this podium. He said, he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. I can't do that. I break the law. I don't know, there's too many of us that can cast the first stone. So yes, maybe there was a law broken by an immigrant, but you know, there's a defense of necessity when you break laws. Maybe you had a pretty good reason. I've got a story a little later to tell you about that. Here's another argument you hear. Get in line. No amnesty. Well, do you know that most people that come here that want to become citizens do have to get in line? They do get in line. They file a petition to become lawful permanent residents. Somebody has to sponsor them usually, a family member. But it's not easy, and they get in line, and I'm telling you, the line is long. So if somebody uses this argument, tell them, yes, in order to become citizens, they do have to get in line. But the line, for instance, if I came here, and I became a citizen, and I wanted to sponsor my brother to come here, if we were from Mexico, he would get in line, and at the current time, the line goes back to the 15th of September, 1997. If he got in line then, they're just getting to his petition. If we were Filipinos, they'd just be getting to his petition if he filed it in 1994. So this line argument is kind of ridiculous sometimes. But people do have to get in line. What about dreamers? We're hearing a lot about dreamers lately. Why the vastly different position that we see by people towards dreamers? Business leaders are in favor of Walmart stores, Target, PepsiCo, 800 companies wrote a letter, open letter, trying to convince the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress, to change the law as to dreamers. Why are they considered so much different? Because they were brought here? Because it wasn't their fault? Well, the day that the current occupant of the White House, September 5th, made his proclamation that he was going to end DACA, I read the comments to the article in the New York Times. Here's one of the comments. The notion that they're law-abiding and should be given some consideration is an insult to citizens. Their mere presence is breaking the law. The original DACA affair was an affront to every legal U.S. resident and citizen. Well, that's pretty strong language. Why is it an affront if people want to come here and become citizens? The cure for DACA is for them to get in a very long line, go through a very complicated process. This DREAM Act that Senator Durbin and a few others are promoting in Congress today. So if you look behind a lot of these people's knee-jerk reactions or arguments, sometimes you see things that you can pretty easily point out are wrong. The cure for DACA is to make them get in a line. Now, there's some people you won't convince. Maybe this guy isn't too obvious to you. Steve King, congressman from Iowa. Here's what he said about DACA. These people came here illegal just like everybody else. No, maybe they're not to blame because their parents brought them. But here's what I think we should do. If they turn in their parents, maybe we'll give them some leeway. I'm making this up, he said this. Is he a fanatic? No, I don't think he's a fanatic, but he's got a reason to say that because he wants to get reelected, and there's enough people in the state of Iowa in his district that think that's correct. So here's a guy that maybe isn't a fanatic, but there's no use trying to convince him because he's got an agenda. So, but I do think sometimes it's useful to talk to Congress people about these things, if you can get them to listen. I'll tell you a story. I call it La Princesa Aguacate, the avocado princess story. An old woman who came here when she was 14. She was from a small town, a small pueblo in southwestern Mexico, where there were a lot of small agricultural areas, plantations, where they grew avocados. Individual farmers with small avocado plantations that grouped together their avocado harvest every year and sold it to the United States. You know, it's a big product here. On Super Bowl Sunday, 1.2 billion avocados are consumed here, so it's a big business. And these guys had small farms, and they were doing pretty good. And one day, the cartel came in to this girl's father and said, "We're taking over your plantation. You're going to sell all, you're going to give all your avocados to us, and we're going to sell them for you. And by the way, we'd like your daughter to come and work for us where we're going to live." They didn't want her to be a secretary. And so that night, her father got together all the money he could, and he said to her, "You're going to America." And she did. She came here by herself. She got away from, obviously, what was going to be a role as a sex slave to some people in a cartel. And she made a life for herself here. She got married. She has 4 kids. They're all Americans. She's in danger of deportation. When she came here, she could have applied for asylum, but she would have had to do it in the first year she was here, when she was 15 instead of 14. There's a couple exceptions to this law. I'm finding a hard time finding one that fits into her situation. Maybe we need to change this law. Could I talk to Adam Kinzinger about this? Get him to listen. What would I do if I wanted to do that? What I'd do is I'd get on the internet and I'd find out everything he's said so far about asylum. Maybe if he could be convinced, I could use a story like this, the avocado princess parable, to try to convince them. So there's a tactic you can use, a technique you can use. But find out what the guy said that you're trying to convince before you get to him. Here's another argument. Only children of native-born parents should be should be citizens by birth. If their parents came here, they weren't citizens, and they gave birth to a child, that child shouldn't get citizenship. Been in the Constitution since it was written. People want to change it. What do you think he'd say about that?
Oh.
His parents were both born in Italy. He wouldn't be a citizen. Well, there's a lot of arguments here and a lot of points that you can think of to counter those arguments, but we have to kind of think about the whole scheme of things. I think for a lot of these people, these guys, it's about a dirty little four-letter word. Fear is what's behind a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And the dirty word isn't fear. The four-letter word isn't fear. If this guy were with us today, he wouldn't be standing in the schoolhouse door. He'd be standing in a different kind of door. There's the dirty four-letter word. You can't see it? The far bottom right of the screen, it's because they're being quiet about it. They're worried that these immigrants are going to get the vote. That's what they're really, do you know that you will not replace us? That's what they're worried about. They've been worrying about this since Reconstruction. There's another argument that you hear. Make everybody speak English. People don't like hearing other people speak other languages than English. In America, it's America, speak English. Molly told me this story. She was at a board meeting of a housing cooperative. She was on the board. One of the people at the meeting said something Brazil. She spoke Brazilian Portuguese. And another person said, well, that's strange. I can speak Brazilian Portuguese too. So they started speaking in this language. Another person at the table said, stop, that really makes me uncomfortable. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from a thing that people have. This is another argument that's really hard to counter. The vague position that it's okay to treat people differently because they're different than you. And you know, this has been in our history for a long time. Molly and I were having lunch with a fellow that's a farmer. He's a dairy farmer, and he told me this story. He told us this story. He said, I was out mowing hay, and my neighbor came over, and he said, hey, you see the spray plane that's spraying chemical on my field? He said, you better get out of your field because that's a really dangerous chemical. Well, our friend Bob said, I saw in this man's field that there was a man walking along the edge of the field as the spray plane went over. He said every time the plane would go over, this guy had walked so many steps to guide the plane so he would know where to come through on his next swoop. And Bob said, well, if it's that dangerous, why have you got that guy out in the field? He said, oh, he's just a Mexican. Bob didn't say anything after that to him. I'll tell you a story that happened to me. Well, it's too sad of a story. I think I'll skip it. So what are these people telling us? What's behind this? They're different than us. Well, you've seen things like this. This idea that multiculturalism is wrong, That's kind of what's behind this idea. These people think they're doing a Christian thing here. They used a Christian basis to justify slavery. This idea that the white race shouldn't be polluted. We shouldn't mix races. Ever see this?
Yeah.
Ever see that?
Yeah.
I was about 8 years old, and I was on a trip with my folks to the South. I'd never been to the South. Tennessee is where we stopped at a gas station, and I saw one like this. It wasn't quite like this. It was on the front of the gas station, 2 men's rooms. Around the side were 2 ladies' rooms. We were traveling with my folks and my grandparents. My grandfather had to get out and get in the bathroom, so he went into one men's room, and I was about to go into the other men's room, and the guy that was pumping the gas said, "Sonny, you can't go in there." I didn't notice over the doors, one said men white, the other said men colored. So I looked at my father, and he said, "You better wait till Grandpa comes out." So I did. And later I said to my dad, "What was going on? What was wrong with the other bathroom?" He said, "It's really complicated. I'll tell you later." He never told me. That's pretty prevalent in Texas not too long ago. From southern New Mexico. My grandfather told me about this one. Same thing, same kind of sentiment. So it's been around a long time. You know, when the Pilgrims got off the boat at Plymouth Rock, they thought they were superior to the natives. When Jacques Cartier went up the St. Lawrence River and he saw natives, he thought he was superior to them. When Cortez got to Mexico, 1519, he thought he was superior to the indigenous people he came on. Why? Well, when Teddy Roosevelt sent Warren Harding to the Philippines, after the U.S. got control of the Philippines from the Spanish, he said, "You're going to have to teach these little brown people how to govern themselves. It's going to be hard because they really don't know how to govern themselves." Teddy Roosevelt was well respected, but he was a pretty serious racist. There are people who think, to this day, I think, that interracial marriage is against the moral law. Charlottesville, Virginia, it's in Virginia. Do you know that up until 1966, I was in 4th year of college in 1966, so recent history for me. In 1966, it was against the law for a white person to marry a person of color. It was a crime, punishable by a jail sentence. That's pretty recent history. So this hasn't gone away. Where does it come from? It comes from the same thing that the Pilgrims had when they got off the boat, and all these other Europeans had when they came here. Divine right European superiority. The idea that the people from Western Europe are exceptional. Still with us today. President Obama was vilified for not always claiming that Americans, and behind that was white people of Western European descent, are not exceptional. They're not superior. And they're not always right. But then look who he was. Not one of us. So this is a tough nut to crack when it comes to anti-immigrant sentiment. But it's sure out there, and it's embedded in our culture, in our society, in our country. That's what I'm called now in some of these circles. You know why? Because I'm a traitor to my race, in their opinion. What's a race traitor? It's a person who's perceived as supporting attitudes or positions thought to be against the interests or well-being of that person's own race. You know what my counter to that is? I'm not against the human race. But there are people who are so convinced to the contrary, I'm not going to waste a lot of time on them. So, how do we change attitudes? Well, I've given you some ideas on how to go behind attitudes. But this is learned behavior. This is something that kids learn. They're not born with prejudice. They're not born with divine right superiority in their heads. They learn it from their parents, from their schools. So what do we do about it? Well, we have a responsibility to teach our own children. We have a responsibility to teach other people's children. We have a responsibility to be careful that the school curricula don't teach this, even subconsciously. We have a duty to stop promoting it. Otherwise, other people will promote the other idea. So you take a contrary position wherever and whenever you can. It involves risk. I'm going to tell you this story that I didn't want to tell you before. I know a homeowner. He had a fellow that I know was a landscape contractor. He came, landscape contractor gave him a bid, a quote, on putting bushes in around this fellow's house. The fellow said, okay, whatever it was, $5,200. They did the work, and came time to pay him. My homeowner friend said, you know what I did? I gave him a check for $400 less. He said, I always do that. He's only a Mexican. I didn't confront him when he told me that. Should I have? Well, it's a risk. If I confronted him, he probably wouldn't be my friend anymore. He was telling me this because he knew this same landscaper was going to do work in my house, and he was trying to give me a hint that I could cheat him too. Now, this guy considers himself a Christian. He goes to church every Sunday. He goes to church more than I go to church. He doesn't see a conflict there. Well, should I have confronted him or not? On one level, I wish I had. Well, there's many ways that you and I can help people obtain some degree of equality, maybe some step towards permanent residence status, towards citizenship, just towards acceptance in our society. And you can do this as well as I can do this. It takes risk. It takes risk. You don't have to be a lawyer to help immigrants, you know. There's classes for citizenship. A lot of them need mentoring. They have to take exams, you know, in government, systems, civics, in English as a second language. Matter of fact, there's a project that I'm looking for somebody to help me with. There's a project to help people like the avocado princess who come to this country. They have a claim for asylum. They're caught. They're put in a detention facility in South Texas, about 4,000 bed detention facility. Women and children mostly. And you know, everybody in this country, every person in this country has rights under the Constitution. Even undocumented immigrants have a right to a lawyer in this country. But in this detention facility, they can't get out to get lawyers. By the way, they're entitled to lawyers. They're not entitled to lawyers at public expense. They have to be able to contact them. And I wanted to go down there, donate a week to advise these people who came in and are seeking asylum. But I was told my Spanish isn't good enough yet, so I'm looking for a partner that'll be my translator. Because here's the statistics. If these people who come in are in detention are able to get a lawyer, 65% of them succeed in getting asylum. If they don't, 4% of them succeed. So there's something that somebody can help me with. Or you can tell stories. You can tell stories in your family at Thanksgiving dinner to humanize people, to make them not statistics, to make them not other. I've been doing this thing just to raise consciousness about multiculturalism. I'm doing it for two reasons. You know, if you've been around me, that my my grandson, whom I call Joselito, I always speak Spanish to him. And I do this in public, not just here or at home. Matter of fact, he's a year and a half old. I think this Wednesday or Thursday, I've never spoken a word of English to him because we want him to grow up bilingual, to have an appreciation for multiculturalism. You can do this too. If you got Italian people in your immigrant history, learn a little Italian and teach it to a kid. Teach them there's a benefit to multiculturalism. So sometimes when I talk to Joselito in Spanish in the public, I see people looking funny at me. Am I making enemies? I don't know. I'm certainly making them aware that we're not all white people speaking English here. I'm trying to celebrate the melting pot. I'm trying to teach people that there is a melting pot still here. And it's not just a melting pot of people from Western Europe, Polish and Irish and German. So maybe that's got a good side to what I'm doing. Maybe it's got a downside to what I'm doing. I'm waiting for the first person that says to me in the grocery store, "Why are you talking some strange language to that kid?" It's a risk I'm going to keep taking. Anyway, I think these guys are going to lose eventually. I think it's a long haul. I think they're fighting a losing battle, though. They won't give up without a fight. The anti-immigrant sentiment that we see, I think, is just a part of something else. I'll tell you that in a minute. I think we shall overcome, we must overcome, but you know the last word of that song, someday. Not going to happen overnight. You know, we're all immigrants here. Nobody raised their hand. We're all from immigrant families. I'll tell you one last story and I'll leave you. It's a good story. It's just happened to me. Makes a point. I hope convinces you. I was at an immigration lawyers conference in the beginning, the first week in August in Denver. It was a Friday and Saturday. And these immigration lawyers are serious. They start their conference at 7:15 in the morning. They give us a 10-minute break in the morning for coffee. They give us a 10-minute break for lunch. You didn't eat lunch, you just went and got it, sat down, and they had another seminar, and you get a 10-minute break in the afternoon. And that lasted until 5:45 the first night, Friday night. And they had a cocktail hour. You had to go to the cocktail hour because that's part of what you're paying for is to network, meet people. And after that, I had a hard time getting there. Flight was canceled, so I got there for part of it. The next day, they started at 7:15 in the morning again and went with the same schedule with these 3 10-minute breaks. And at the end of it, I was really crashed. And most of these people had to go to work, so they ran out to the airport, and I was staying overnight. Wasn't leaving Denver until Sunday. So I said, I'm going to go up to the top floor of this hotel. I'm going to have a glass of wine. And I did. It was a beautiful night in August. Sun was setting over the Rocky Mountains. The top floor of this hotel could see out into the foothills. And Saturday night, 6:30 by now, there was a table open. So I took the table. I sat down next to a couple who were just ordering, or they were actually had given their order to the waitress, and they were asking the waitress some questions about what they were looking at in the Rocky Mountains and what was this sports stadium they could see. And so after the waitress took their order, she took my order. I ordered my glass of wine. I was ready to talk to somebody who wasn't a lawyer, so I struck up a conversation. This couple was a little bit younger than me. They were a black couple. I mentioned their race only because it plays into the story. I said, I understand you're not from your questions. I understand you're not from here. And the fellow said, no, we're from Detroit. Actually, we're from a suburb of Detroit, Romulus. You probably never heard of it. I said, yeah, I have heard of it. I said, I went to school in Detroit. You did? I said, yeah, I know where Romulus is. I said, I used to work near there. He said, where'd you work? I said, I worked in Dearborn at the Rouge plant. Ford assembly plant. He said, you did? I worked there too. He said, I just retired. That's what we're doing here. He said, I worked my whole life, raised the kids, and I took my wife Isabel on a trip here. We're going to see some of the United States. He said, what'd you do? And I told him I swept the floors in the steel mill part of the plant in the third shift, make money to get through school. He said, well, I worked 30 years on the floor. Now that's UAW speak for. He didn't work on the line, the assembly line. He worked to feed the line. He was just an assistant. So he introduced himself. His name was Gerald. He said, really not from Detroit area. He said, I immigrated from Grand Rapids. So I came here when I was about 17, lied about my age, got a job in a factory. He said, I worked there my whole life. I said, well, I didn't work there my whole life. I said, I got a different job. I studied engineering, but I didn't get to be an engineer the rest of my work life. I was a lawyer. He said, you're a lawyer. What are you doing here in Denver? I said, it's the Immigration Law Conference. He said, oh, immigration. He said, that's a big, hot issue here in our society today. You know what it is? Just another kind of racism. I said, well, you know what? It's really different now. It's kind of a growth industry now, this immigration law with the change in Washington. He said, yep. He said, sure is different from when we had President Obama, isn't it? And I said, yeah. I said, you know, Gerald, it's one of the things I'm proudest of doing. I said, when he was running for the first time, my daughter and I went to Toledo, and we walked the streets for 11 days before the election, getting votes, knocking on doors. He said, you're kidding. He said, I worked in Toledo myself. He said, Isabel here thought I was crazy. She told me I was crazy. 14 days before the election, I did that. Got up in the morning from Romulus, Michigan, drove down there, and I got there so, people were done with their coffee. I could start knocking on doors, and I worked till it was getting too dark. I drove back to Romulus, fell into bed. My legs were killing me. Got up the next day, did it again. I did it for 14 days. He said, Isabel told me I was crazy. And I said, I'm not crazy, I'm a drop. He said, I'm just a drop. He said, Isabel, I'm a drop. There's a couple other drops working. He said, pretty soon we're going to get a trickle together. He said, we get enough trickles, we're going to get a rivulet. 30 years on the shop floor, never got out of high school. That was his word, rivulet. He said, you know what happens when we get enough rivulets? We get a stream. He said, you know what happens when we get enough streams together? We get a river. We get a river rolling. It's going to move boulders. He said, it can move mountains. He said, you know what? We moved a mountain, us drops. We got Barack Obama elected president of the United States. Wow, he said. He jumped up and he stuck out his hand and he says, brother, I want to thank you for helping me get Brother Barack Obama elected president of the United States. He said, it's just us drops. So here I am. I'm one of those drops. I got a couple of drops with me. I don't know if we got a trickle going there yet, but we're going to get a trickle going, and we're going to get a river going, and we're going to move this mountain called anti-immigrant sentiment fever. We can do it. We got to do it. Only you and I can do it. I think we can do it. Thank you. I hope you try.
John, do you want to answer questions?
Question?
One of your slides with the little girl with the cross. Kim, maybe you know this a little bit. Look at in the center of that cross.
It's a teardrop.
It's a teardrop?
Red.
There's a flame.
I don't know what that's for.
Because our UCC, one of our symbols is a comma. red comma.
Which is
Yeah, but
upside
it's
down.
going
Which
the
is upside
opposite
down.
way. It's upside
I
down.
know. And that just caught my eye, and I thought, no, wait a minute. So I figured that had some sort of meaning, but how interesting that it would just be the reverse of ours.
That's a scary picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll,
That's Chicago. That's Grant Park. 1922. That was Grant Park. These people, I don't know if you know this. You know why they have this burning cross? It's a custom that came from Scotland. They lit the cross to show that they were on fire with Christianity, the fire of Christ. They think they're doing the Christian thing here.
okay, I've got the answer for you. From the Anti-Defamation League, the blood drop cross is, well, they categorize it as a hate symbol. And it's part of the mystic insignia of a Klansman, more commonly referred to as the blood drop cross, white square cross against a circular red background. The middle of the cross is what appears to be a drop of red blood. The symbol originated as 4-letter K images with a yin-yang in the middle. And at some point they were rearranged to make it look like a blood drop, representing the blood shed to protect the white race. So, I know.
Any questions?
So John, when you were talking about the people in the detention center that we think of as illegal immigrants, but a number of them seem to qualify for asylum, but they don't know that they can apply. I mean,
I saw a study by a group, a church group, who was running a shelter on the other side of the border. I don't know if it was in Nogales. Anyway, they had interviewed 948 people who had been rejected at the border for asylum claims. And they were the study was to take a survey of what they were told by the immigration officers. And they were told things like, there's no more asylum for this year. Trump canceled asylum. We only let in so many a year and we're out of them. None of which was true. The people who at the border are supposed to, by law, by regulation, they're supposed to be asked, do you have a claim for asylum? And they ask it in terms that are more understandable than that. Do you have any reason to be afraid to go back to your country? Most of them were not asked that question. But if they are asked that question, they're entitled to a hearing before an asylum officer, a special kind of immigration person that's supposed to guide them through the steps to decide whether they have a viable claim. It's called a credible fear interview. Most of them don't get that. If they do, though, if they're insistent enough, then they can put in a claim for asylum. It's a complicated process, and like I said, only 4% of them can succeed if they don't have legal help.
So, of like people in our community that we might know who don't have documented legal status, documented immigration status, what are their chances of succeeding in getting documented status?
Gee, I don't know a statistic on it, but I can tell you this. There's 185 different kinds of visas that people can apply for. Some of them are employment-related, some of them are family-based. Some of them are as unrelated to things you'd think of as if you're the victim of a crime, you can apply for a visa that leads to permanent resident status. If you're a victim of domestic violence, you can apply for a visa that eventually can lead you to a work permit and green card permanent resident status. There's all kinds of ways. The main deterrent, I think, to people is, number one, they don't know where to go. Number two, they think it's going to be very expensive. It is pretty expensive. For instance, if I came to this country from another country and I got citizenship and I wanted to sponsor my wife to come after me, the fees for the paperwork, the petitions and supporting documents cost over $3,100. That's not what a lawyer might charge. That's just what the government fees are. All these things have a pretty large fee because this part of the government is not supported entirely by tax dollars, it's supported by fees. So when the immigration officers want to raise, they raise a fee. So it's a pretty expensive process. But people are also afraid. Here's something that I've run into. DACA students have to basically give Customs and Immigration all the information they need to come and find them and take them back when their DACA permit runs out. Or if it isn't, if they file an application and it wasn't allowed, they're just giving the government all the information about how to find them and their families. So they're afraid to do this. So I think there's a big factor there. People are afraid because after they file some kind of petition, whether it's for a temporary status or to lead to a permanent status, until they get there, they don't have much to stand on. You know, if they're sitting at a stoplight, somebody runs in the back of them, and they're in the wrong place, where Joe Arpaio might have some deputies out there, they're out of luck. So they're afraid. I think that's a big part of it. So I think one of the things you can do is convince them to try and support them in their fear and give them some kind of support so they do something. You know, a lot of them, you know, people I'm running into now, they weren't afraid. I have a friend who's been here for 30 years. Never worried about this till the political winds started blowing different last fall. Now, they're doing something about it because they're afraid. But there's a lot of them that are still afraid. They're too afraid to do anything. So there's something you can do is support people like that. Moral support, emotional support. Because they have a justified fear, I think. We don't know what's going to happen to all that information that those DACA students gave the government. Theoretically, could be turned over. What it says, what they say now in their policy that they put out is that ICE will not, we will not proactively give ICE the information that we have on DACA students. If ICE asks, they don't say what they'll do. So I think there's a large factor of fear, and the factor of cost is a big factor to people. You know, we're not talking about all Nobel Prize winners here. Guys that work, you know, regular jobs. So they need support. Any other points or questions? I hope I gave you some ammunition. Oh, go ahead.
I had a friend who was an office holder in the General Assembly of the United Methodist Church. Okay, and he was like he was a higher up member. Okay, and he was late coming in for the meeting that he was supposed to lead. And then he finally came in and he said, I am so sorry. I had a terrible experience. And we were saying, well, what's the matter, girl? What's wrong? He said, I was stopped by the police and arrested because I looked like I might be a Mexican who didn't have the right to be here. And he said, I was born here in the United States. And he said, they held me for 3 hours under, before we finally were able to prove to them so that they would let me go. And I could come to the church here to the conference.
Happens all the time. It's happening still. 2014, here's a story I read. 2014, Joe Arpaio sent his deputies out on the street, big raid, you know. They collected 234 people. 3 of them were undocumented. All the rest got held in jail for a while till they could have their families bring some kind of proof that they weren't undocumented. But it happens all the time. I'm not saying it couldn't happen here. Another big issue is whether local law enforcement should hold people beyond their jail sentence under Illinois law until ICE can come and collect them. Legislature just passed a bill dealing with that. Doesn't mean people still can't be held. Certain sheriffs might not like that law.
The sheriff of McHenry County, for one, is one who doesn't like that law, and he's holding people, and he's being sued. So, you know, it's not the issue of the Southwest.
Oh no, it's not just
Everywhere.
localized to the Southwest.
So what's the status in sanctuary cities, and what's the status of churches that reach out to people in distress and provide sanctuary?
That's a really long, complicated answer to that question.
Make it short.
I'll tell you, the short answer is this. ICE can come into a church and arrest somebody that's there in sanctuary. Sanctuary is not a legal term. It's been around from back in the Middle Ages when people sought sanctuary to keep the king's men from coming and clapping them in irons. It's a concept that doesn't have a basis in law, but ICE has a policy that says they will not go into sensitive locations to pick up people who are immigrants, undocumented immigrants, unless there's extenuating circumstances. And so they can do it. So the idea of sanctuary cities or sanctuary churches is really not a legal status at the moment. But what it does is raise consciousness about the issue. You know, today, actually the day before yesterday, the 11th person went into sanctuary in a church in the United States. As much as you hear about it, up until the other day, there were 10 people in sanctuary churches. It's a complicated subject for the church. It's a complicated subject for the people in the congregation. It's a complicated subject for a city. They're having all these lawsuits now. Rahm Emanuel and I think Jerry Brown have sued Jeff Sessions to undo this thing that they're not going to get grants unless they agree to turn over people to ICE, let their police be enforcers for them. Don't forget, people that are here from another country that overstay a visa have not committed a crime. They've broken a civil law, like if you don't pay your real estate tax on time. And ICE comes around to people's houses and says, we have a warrant. It's not a warrant signed by a judge. It's just one of their administrative civil warrants. Don't have a right to come in a person's house. So they don't have a right to come in a church and pick that person up. Unless that person also was here, committed a crime, and they have a warrant signed by a judge. So this is a real complicated area. The good benefit, I think, to sanctuary cities and sanctuary states and churches is raising consciousness about making the people human that are in sanctuary. I'm going to do a little something on that here in a few weeks or days. I don't know. Talk about the process of becoming sanctuary church. It's a pretty interesting subject, but it's not without its dangers, and it's not a legal thing. It's not civil disobedience, it's in a gray area. questions? Somebody has any? That's you, Abigail?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, when you were talking about, the risks to people applying, whether it's for DACA or a visa or anything. At this time, is it worth it? I mean, do you advise people to come out and put themselves on record and, do you know what I mean? I feel like, I wanna say, yes, you should follow the rules, but I don't know, do you trust the?
Well, I'm in a tough place because I'm not allowed to tell anybody to do something illegal.
Sure.
You can do that and not break the law, but if I did it, I could lose my license for doing it.
Would you suggest?
However, what you can do is explain to a person what happens on this side of the question if you want to do something, or what happens if you don't do it. And let them decide, but let them know that there are options.
It's really scary right
You know,
now.
just on DACA people, some of them are gonna have their status permits run out starting on the 6th of March. They don't have any protection at all. Actually, they don't have much protection except that they have a deferral from deportation while they're under that status. After that goes away, if the Congress does something, I bet on the Cubs winning the World Series again before I bet on that. But there are options for people, but they have risks. I don't know how else to put it. They have to take a risk. And it's a pretty big risk in some cases. If a person has a petition pending to get a green card, to get permanent status, and that person is picked up and brought into immigration court for deportation, he could say, look, I have a petition pending. And if the immigration judge wants to, he can say, okay, we'll suspend your case, we'll put your case on hold to see what happens with your petition. But if that petition is denied, so, right out. So he puts himself at risk that way.
I have a comment. I think in this time of social media and things that, people get their information, their misinformation, I think when you encounter someone who says something a little crazy or all these DACA or the illegal immigrants and all this, you gotta do a little digging to kind of see where are they getting that information from, or what's the underlying thing of it. I was in a car with 3 women I consider my friends, and we were coming back from Peoria, and after that was all said and done with, I'm like, I'm kind of sad these people are my friends, and I was a little, just because we weren't talking about immigration per se, it was more around healthcare, and it was, it's a very sticky situation. And one of the women in the car, and she's a single mom, and she's like, I don't have insurance. And, I wanted to say to her, did you vote? And, and she goes, I really can't afford it. And I'm like, well, okay, then why don't you get on the bus for socialized medicine? And, and I start bringing them, someone else's, it's very, people are very judgmental. And I just got out of the car and I felt terrible. And these are people I've known for years, but we've never discussed these issues. We've never, I hear the craziest things. And when I used to work in Streeter, one of our employees, I assume was a legalized citizen. She went to high school in Streeter and whatever. Well, she gets married, has a baby. Then one day she's all boo-hooey. I'm like, what's wrong? And they're like, well, they're sending my husband back to Mexico. I go, well, why is that? I mean, I knew her husband's first language wasn't English and that. And, I didn't know them a whole lot. And she's like, well, but I knew he worked for the railroad. I knew this guy had a job. And, I'm like, well, how can you have a job, a decent job, just not picking up, legitimate job? And, when I used to have to hire people, it was the forms of identification and all that, rigmarole. And, and she's like, well, so, and then she asked us, she goes, will you write letters on his behalf? I said, yeah, I'll write letters. Because, I'm like, here's a guy who has been, and maybe he circumvented the proper channel to get here. But it was like, it's real stuff even here in our county, so don't take that for granted. But so he had to go live back in Mexico for another 6 months, but it did cost some money. It was, that, oh my gosh, it's so much money and stuff. And, part of me's thinking, why didn't he do it the right way? Then I'm like, well, that ship sailed, you know, they've got a kid now, and she's a US citizen, and even that didn't count, and I knew that from my own cousin stationed over in Germany, married a German girl, nice, you know, European descent. They went through a whole rigmarole because they thought it was a whole fixed marriage. I mean, he's a ER doc down in St. Louis, and she's a very brilliant woman. But, you know, the trips they had to take Chicago up to immigration and, you know, all that. It's, you know, and that's been, you know, probably 20 years ago that went on. But I think when other things, when I hear people grumbling, see what's fueling their misinformation and stuff. I mean, I saw crazy stuff on Facebook today, and I'm just like, with the whole kneel or not kneel, and I'm like, you know what? I'm like, what? Whoa, what is wrong? I mean, it's like, you have a decent house and stuff, and you're gonna sit there and carry on like, you know, this is, you know, the worst thing in the world. I always thought of it, my God, there's people in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and even our fellow citizens down in Texas and, you know, Florida who probably don't have electricity. But we're all up in arms because some people are kneeling, some people are standing. It doesn't matter. But I think that's the thing. It always gets changed. And you talk about being a drop. Well, now it's just like a spray, and we're constantly like, well, is it healthcare? Is it DACA? Is it this? You know, what? I feel like such a revolving door. Where do we focus our energies? That's my question.
You have to, very good point. You have to pick an issue and work on it. By the way, this maybe doesn't quite relate, but you hear figures, you see them on the news, there's 11 million undocumented immigrants here. 50,000 of them are from Ireland. Nobody's worried about that.
No.
100,000 of them are Canadians that snuck in here and overstayed their visas. Nobody's thinking about them.
Chicago was the illegal Polish people living in the basement.
Nobody knows.
You know, yeah.
The next group on my tip of my tongue is Polish people. They don't know how many undocumented Polish people are in Chicago.
That's right.
Nobody's worried about them. That's why I think, like my friend Gerald there in the cocktail lounge, this is just racism. He actually said that. He said, this is just another form of racism. He said, we've been fighting this since Reconstruction. It's just racism, John. So, you see this distinction between...
Here's a horror story for you. And I mean a horror story, at least to me anyway, it's a horror story, is I know of people who have a young child who was at the time about 7 years old, okay? The parents did not have the papers. He did not have the papers. Immigration took that 7-year-old child and shipped him back to Mexico where he knew no one and just dropped him while his family was up here in the United States. That is a horror story.
I think it's happening.
Well, I know it's happening.
More than to him.
The thing that really concerns me about people's inability to achieve safe documented status is just the fact that people can be treated by employers as basically slave labor. I mean, there's this famous case of a kosher meatpacking plant in Iowa that was using all undocumented workers, and it was a slaughterhouse, and it's a very, very dangerous work, and they were basically just like using people until they got horribly injured, and then discarding them because they had no legal responsibility to take care of them, to provide any kind of health care, workers' compensation, and the injuries are horrific, but they pay them substandard wages, and then just discard them as soon as they're injured and not take care of them at all, and throw them upon the charity of whatever church or hospital happens to be nearby.
There are two sides to that coin.
People are just being treated like slaves, basically.
Here's the other side of that coin. This study by the Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania, said that one of the reasons that undocumented immigrants are good for this country is They keep consumer prices low. Meat would be more expensive if they were all documented. Farm labor would be more expensive if they were all documented because they have to be paid the minimum wage. So they're depressing consumer prices. That's a benefit to consumers. You know, there's a lot of restaurateurs that don't want to have these people get green cards. Then they have to pay them a minimum wage. Pay them benefits, pay them unemployment, pay them if they get hurt on the job. So there's an argument that that's good for it's been made, that that's good for the country because it's keeping consumer prices low. You know, there's a guy that ran a dairy up here in Aurora. He was hiring undocumented people to clean it after hours, paying them $1.25 an hour. You might buy their ice cream. I won't buy their ice cream. Oberweis Dairy.
I have a story I should tell you about our school system. I worked at Shepherd Junior High for 30 years. And a few years later, Dr. Marino wanted us to have a foreign language class. And I looked at the Spanish, so he sent me down to Mexico to get my skills up. Anyway, one day I was called down to the school office and we had benches along one side. And on those benches was a group of Mexican people. And they had come in off the highway and they wanted to put their kids in our school system. So, they had one piece of paper that had been photocopied, and that was, like a visa or it was an ID card for all these people. So, the principal asked me if I would take the oldest girl and put her in my Spanish class, and she could help the kids, that I was already working with. And, I used to tell them, tell me your name and how old are you and when's your birthday and what's your favorite food and stuff like that to kind of get their vocabulary going. So, the little girl, the oldest girl that was in my classroom, I asked her, how many years they are to it, and she said, Tengo 17 años. I am 17 years old. I have 7th graders. And that put me in quite a quandary because she really belonged at Ottawa High School. But she was almost 18 and I couldn't put an 18-year-old girl in a classroom of kids that are 11 and 12 years old. That just isn't good for the girl that was there. So, I talked to the counselor about it. And, they did send her to Ottawa High School, and she's still around, but, I really had mixed feelings about it, because I was trying to help her, and she couldn't write, and she couldn't spell, and she couldn't read. So there I was, trying to figure out what I was gonna do. And, I tried to speak with her, and she could speak her language, but she couldn't read it or write it. But it was kind of sad, to see 8 people sitting there with one little tiny piece of paper. And I don't know how they survived, I really don't.
Well, the important thing is you did something. You took some action.
Well, I always said I had the best job in the world, and I loved Shepherd School.
First, thank you for a great presentation and leading a great discussion. I think you bring up an important point about taking action and about taking risk and speaking up. when we hear people speak like this, I think that oftentimes it's not comfortable and it's not easy, but it's really important that we all put ourselves forward to do the right thing and to speak up on the issue. And so I think you bring up an important point about that. Second, though, if people want to have an impact philanthropically, are there organizations that are doing work in this area that we could donate to, that you would suggest we support?
Organizations that are helping immigrants get legal help?
Yes.
Yeah, there is one called Clinic, and it stands for Catholic Legal Immigration. I don't know, you find it on the internet. Catholic Charities actually does work on this. There is a not-for-profit organization in Rockford that's helping immigrants get legal help. There's a thing called the Immigration Project, has an office in Champaign and Bloomington. They're doing a lot of work, but they're inundated now. 10, 15, 20 times the people that few staff members they have can handle. But there are organizations that are doing this, that are helping people with legal problems. You can start one.
What are your requirements for your translator for your work in Texas?
Very good Spanish, fluent in Spanish.
Anything else? Age, status? Are you looking for somebody with legal understanding or just Spanish?
Just Spanish. Age, I think because we're going into a federal detention facility, we'd have to all be adults.
18.
Yeah. But I think what they told me before I started the training, and as the reason I opted out of the training was because they said, you have to be fluent in Spanish. You have to be able to, and you know, I've been studying Spanish a little bit. My teacher said to me the other day, I was complaining to him, and he said to me, you know, you have to learn 2 Spanishes. You have to learn the stuff that we teach in Spanish class, then you have to learn conversational, you know, slang, the way people talk. And I don't have a good enough understanding of what people are telling me to practice law in Spanish yet. I'm going to get there sometime, I hope, but I need a translator to do this because we're dealing with people's lives here. I'm not going to take a chance.
If an undocumented person living in the United States wants to start the documentation process, can they do it in the United States, or do they have to be outside of the country to do it?
They can do it in the United States, but for instance, a family-based petition can be started in the United States by a sponsor, a U.S. citizen sponsor, or a lawful permanent resident green card holder sponsor. And then that person actually, the way to look at it is that person makes an application, an invitation, and then the person who is undocumented has to also make a petition. They can do that in the United States. It's called, technical term is adjustment of status from undocumented to documented. And sometimes that can be done without the immigrant leaving the United States, sometimes not. And it's a pretty complicated system of a chart that we have to go through to find which one of those applies. But in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. And you can't really tell until you hear the person's story and his family story and where he fits in the system. But it is possible in some cases. Obviously, you want to do that instead of sending somebody back to his home country, because who knows what they might not do to the law while he's gone for 2 weeks.
When people are trying to find help, the legal aid clinics are not helpful, are they?
The legal aid clinics are not helpful for this reason. Legal aid clinics, like our one here at Prairie State Legal Services, cannot help people who are not documented because their grants are federal grants, and the federal grants prohibit them from helping people who are not citizens or having applied for citizenship.
One of the common things I hear you saying when we talk about the process of documentation is that it's very complicated.
Yes. question, I would say it's the exact opposite. There are a lot of proposals in Congress now to make it, number one, more restrictive, number two, more complicated, more onerous. The form to apply for a family-based immigration petition a couple of years ago was 4 pages, it's 18 now. That's just a random example. It's getting much more complicated, and people want to make it more complicated. There's a bill, I don't remember if I referred to it or not, called the RAISE Act. And it's supposed to, the sponsors say, change our system from basically a family-based petition system to a point system. These guys that are sponsoring it, 2 senators, say it's like the Canadian system. Well, the Canadian system, if you ask Canadians, isn't working. I could go into a long story about that, but I won't. But what they want to do is basically do away with 87% of the petitions which are family-based. So that's why I brought up the thing about lobbying congressmen. Some of them might be able to be convinced, but I think there's a lot of things out there, and here's the fear I have. They're going to have to trade DACA protection, a replacement for DACA, for a lot more onerous parts of the immigration code as it relates to family petitions. Because they don't want these people to bring their brothers and sisters and their mothers and their children. You know why? They're all going to get a vote sooner or later when they get to be citizens. That's kind of my goal. All I want to do is get somebody through this process and take them up to Chicago and have them raise their hand and take the oath, become citizens. And I'm going to bring them right back here to the LaSalle County Courthouse and say, okay, now you're going to register to vote. That's how we win this game in the long run. I'll tell you a short story. Can I do this? 2 minutes more? I have a friend, he just died, in Ireland. A lot of my family still lives in Ireland. I used to go back there quite a bit. Anyway, I sat down one day with him and I said, Patsy, this was right after they signed the peace in Northern Ireland, 1996. I said, how's this going to come out? He said, it's not going to change in our generation. It's not going to change in our children's generation. He said, we're just going to have to wait around and breed it out of them. He said, you know how this peace got signed? He said, Bill Clinton hired an actuary, and he showed the Catholics that in 2016, last year, there will be more Catholic people in Northern Ireland than Protestants. And 18 years later, they'll be able to outvote the Protestants. And that convinced the Catholics to sign the peace. The point of the story is, sooner or later, the white folks are going to be outvoted. In the city of Chicago today, white people represent 32% of the voting population. 29% of the voting population is black. 29% of the voting population is Latino. So in Chicago today, the white people are outvoted. In this country, an actuary could tell you, a demographer could tell you when people of European descent are going to be outvoted. And I think that's the end result here. What we have to do is fight a delaying action until that happens. But there's a lot of things that we can do in the meantime. One of them is help people through this process to be citizens, to become citizens. Kind of a long process. Those figures I told you about, if I was from Mexico and I got citizenship, I wanted my brother to come, how long he'd have to wait. So it's a long process, but it's not an impossible process. And it's a good thing to try to do. And if you get somebody started on it and you get them pumped up, they'll get more courage, they'll get more support. Some of them will make it through. That's our hope. That's our goal, my goal.
The good thing is you've left people with more questions to ask than answers. That's a good thing. That's an awesome thing. Once again, let's thank John. us to engage and to take risks, and for the work that you are engaged in yourself. And maybe some folks' wheels are spinning after this conversation. I'm just going to toss one more thing out at you. On Sunday evenings, not this Sunday evening obviously, we have a group that meets kind of in chunks called Vine, Brew, and Bean. You can bring your own vine, brew, or bean drinks, or whatever else it is you like to drink. And we have some conversations. And over the next several weeks, we're going to be using a curriculum from the United Church of Christ. We talk about in relationship to this white privilege. And that has a huge part in this whole conversation, that whole thing about keeping other people from voting to keep our power. It's open to anybody, and we generally start about 7 o'clock, run about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So if you want to come and have a conversation about that end of it, please feel free to join us on Sunday evenings at 7 o'clock. There are all kinds of goodies in the other room. And John is here if you want to have some, ask some questions that you didn't necessarily want to say out loud. We'll also have a videotape of this soon up on our website. So if you want to go back and revisit this or share it with somebody else, please feel free to engage other people in the conversation. Thank you very much for being here tonight.